The night of my graduation was supposed to be simple. A dinner, a toast, a few polite smiles to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Instead, it became the moment my family finally showed me exactly where I stood. Halfway through the meal, my father leaned across the table and said, calmly, as if he were asking for the salt, "You need to give your inheritance to your sister. Tonight." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. He didn't smile. "You don't deserve Grandpa's money," he added. When I refused, he reached into his bag, pulled out my diploma, and held it up while everyone stared. The edges curled and darkened as the flame touched the paper. Gasps filled the room. My mother froze. My sister looked away. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I smiled, stood up, and walked out. Because the reason I stayed so calm that night wasn't something they could burn, and at the lawyer's office the following week, they were about to learn exactly why. My name is Chloe, and for most of my life, I learned how to disappear without ever leaving the room. It wasn't something anyone taught me directly. No one sat me down and said, "Be quiet, Chloe, be small." It was something I absorbed slowly. The way you absorb cold in a house that's never fully warm, you stop expecting heat. You learn to layer yourself in silence. In my family, there was always a clear rhythm. My father, Richard, spoke with certainty and expected obedience. My mother, Linda, smoothed everything over with polite smiles and careful excuses. And then there was my younger sister, Emily, bright, emotional, expressive. The kind of child adults noticed immediately. I was the other one. At family gatherings, relatives would gush over Emily. "She's so talented. She has such a strong personality. You can already tell she's going places." Then someone would turn to my parents and ask, "And what about Chloe?" My mother would smile. "Oh, Chloe's easy. She's very responsible." Responsible. That word followed me everywhere. It sounded like praise, but it functioned more like a dismissal. It meant I didn't need checking in on. It meant I didn't need encouragement. It meant I would understand when my needs came second. I understood a lot. When I was 11, I spent weeks building a small robotics project for a school exhibition. I stayed up late, wiring pieces together, fixing mistakes, learning through trial and error. On the day of the event, I waited by the front door with my project in my arms while my parents rushed past me. "We're running late," my father said, grabbing his keys. "Emily has her art workshop across town." I walked to the school gym alone, dragging my project behind me. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I didn't need them there. But when other kids posed for photos with their parents, I felt something settle quietly in my chest, something heavy, something familiar. At 15, I was accepted into a competitive academic program in another state. I boarded an overnight bus with a single suitcase, hugging my parents goodbye in a crowded terminal. My mother reminded me to eat properly. My father reminded me not to cause trouble. They didn't ask if I was nervous. They didn't ask if I was proud of myself. I learned not to expect those questions. I became good at being low maintenance. I handled paperwork. I managed deadlines. I solved problems before anyone else noticed they existed. Teachers praised me. Supervisors trusted me. At home, none of it seemed to register, except with one person. My grandfather, Thomas, noticed everything. He didn't interrupt conversations to praise me. He didn't announce my achievements to others. He just listened, really listened when I spoke. When I explained how something worked, he didn't rush me. When I asked questions, he didn't brush them off. Sometimes he would just nod and say, "You think things through." Once, when I was 16, I asked him why he always waited before responding. He smiled and said, "People who talk fast usually want control. People who listen first usually already have it." That stayed with me. We spent quiet afternoons together. He taught me how to read contracts, how to notice what wasn't written, how to recognize pressure disguised as kindness. He never criticized my parents directly, but I could hear concern in the spaces between his words. "Families don't always reward fairness," he told me once. "Sometimes they reward convenience." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I only knew that when I was with him, I didn't feel invisible. By the time I left for college, I had mastered the art of being calm, of not reacting too quickly, of keeping my emotions controlled. My parents called it maturity. They said, "Chloe never makes things difficult." What they didn't realize was that I wasn't calm, because I didn't feel things. I was calm because I'd learned that showing how much something hurt never changed the outcome. And by the time my graduation dinner arrived, that lesson had shaped me into someone they no longer recognized, someone who knew exactly when to stay quiet and when to stop being small. If my parents taught me how to be quiet, my grandfather taught me why that quiet mattered. His name was Thomas Miller, and to the rest of the family, he was simply an old man who'd done well for himself and preferred to stay out of arguments. To me, he was the only person who ever seemed to understand that silence didn't mean absence, it meant observation. When I was growing up, Grandpa never asked me to perform. He never pushed me to explain myself quickly or loudly. When I spoke, he waited. When I stopped, he didn't rush to fill the space. That alone made me feel seen in a way I never had before. I started visiting him more often during my late teens. Sometimes we'd sit in his kitchen with mugs of coffee growing cold between us. Other times, we'd walk slowly through his backyard while he talked about the company he'd built from nothing. How easy it was to lose control when you trusted the wrong people. People show you who they are when money is involved, he once said, carefully trimming a rose bush. Especially family. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He wasn't asking for reassurance, he was giving a warning. As I got older, our conversations changed. He began asking about my classes, my goals, what kind of work I enjoyed. I told him about systems, problem solving, long-term planning. He listened with the same quiet focus he gave everything. One afternoon during my junior year of college, he surprised me by handing me a thick folder. "Read this," he said. Inside were documents, old contracts, business records, amendments scribbled in the margins. I stared at them, confused. "You don't need to understand everything yet," he said gently. "But you should learn how people protect what matters to them." That was the first time anyone in my family had treated me as someone capable of responsibility, not just someone convenient to rely on. My parents, meanwhile, barely noticed the shift. They were busy supporting Emily's plans. New ideas, new expenses, new dreams that always seemed to require someone else's money. Whenever my grandfather helped her, they praised his generosity. Whenever he spent time with me, they called it indulgence. "You're lucky Grandpa likes you," my mother once said, half smiling. "He worries too much." I wondered who he was really worried about. When Grandpa's health began to decline, the visits became more frequent. He tired easily, but his mind stayed sharp. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the room filled with shadows, he looked at me and said something that changed everything. "Chloe, when I'm gone, they're going to rush you." I felt my chest tighten. "Who?" "Your parents, your sister." He paused. "They'll call it family. They'll call it fairness. But it will be about control." I didn't know what to say. He reached for my hand. His grip was firm, steady. "Whatever they ask, don't answer right away. Don't explain yourself. Let the process protect you." "The process?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "The law exists for a reason. It's slower than emotions, and much harder to manipulate." I note never to it. A few months later, he passed away quietly in his sleep. At the funeral, my parents cried openly. Emily clung to my mother, whispering about how much she'd miss him. I stood a few steps back, numb, replaying his words over and over in my head. "They're going to rush you." After that, things changed subtly but unmistakably. My parents started asking questions. Casual ones at first. Did Grandpa ever mention the house? Did he talk about the business recently? Did he say anything about his plans? I answered honestly. No. But I noticed how their tone shifted. How conversations seemed to circle back to money, responsibility, and who needed support. Emily talked more openly about her future studios she wanted to open, trips she planned to take, projects she hadn't fully thought through. "You're already set, Chloe," my father said once. "You don't really need much." I didn't argue. By the time graduation approached, I felt it coming, the unspoken expectation. The decision they believed had already been made without me. Still, a part of me hoped I was wrong. I told myself that maybe the dinner would be different. Maybe this time, they'd simply celebrate. Maybe they'd see me not as the easy daughter, not as the quiet one, but as someone who had earned her place. I didn't know then that the graduation dinner wasn't meant to honor me at all. It was meant to corner me, and thanks to my grandfather, I was more prepared than they ever imagined. By the time graduation week arrived, something in the air felt wrong. On the surface, everything looked normal. My parents insisted on hosting a dinner at a well-known restaurant downtown, white tablecloths, soft lighting, the kind of place where people spoke quietly and pretended nothing unpleasant ever happened. "It's your night," my mother said on the phone. "We want it to be special." But the way she said it made my stomach tighten. Too careful, too rehearsed. In the days leading up to the dinner, the messages started coming more frequently. My father asked what time I'd arrive. My mother asked what I planned to wear. Emily asked casually if I'd spoken to the lawyer recently. That question lingered. "No," I replied. "Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said quickly. "Just curious." Curious. That was the word they used when they wanted information without appearing greedy. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, this was my graduation. 4 years of work, late nights, missed weekends. I wanted just once to believe they were proud of me. The evening of the dinner, I arrived early. I stood outside the restaurant for a moment, smoothing my dress, taking a slow breath. Through the window, I could already see my family seated at the table. Emily was laughing. My parents leaned toward her, engaged, animated. No one noticed me yet. When I walked in, my mother stood up immediately. "There you are," she said, hugging me tightly, too tightly. "We were just talking about you." I wondered what that conversation had really sounded like. The dinner began politely. Relatives congratulated me. Glasses clinked. My father nodded when people praised my job offer, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. Emily talked about herself, new ideas, vague plans, expensive dreams. She spoke as if the future were already paid for. My parents listened intently, offering encouragement, suggestions, reassurance. When the conversation turned to me, it felt thinner. "So," my father said, cutting into his steak, "you'll be working long hours." "I'm ready for that," I replied. "You always are," he said. It sounded like praise. It wasn't. I noticed small things then. My father checking his watch repeatedly. My mother barely touching her food. Emily leaning back in her chair, watching me with an unreadable expression. They weren't here to celebrate. They were waiting. When dessert arrived, my father cleared his throat. The sound sliced cleanly through the table chatter. "Chloe," he said, reaching into his briefcase. "We need to talk." My chest tightened, but my face stayed calm. He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward me. The leather scraped softly against the wood. Inside, I could see the edges of documents neatly stacked. Official, deliberate. My mother folded her hands. Emily stopped smiling. "This is important," my father continued. "Your grandfather trusted you, but you already have stability. Emily doesn't." I didn't open the folder. "I didn't need to." "You want me to give up my inheritance," I said quietly. My mother nodded. "Just temporarily. So your sister can manage things." Manage, that word again. "I'm not signing anything," I said. The table went silent. Emily blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. My father frowned, as if I'd spoken in the wrong language. "Don't be difficult, Chloe," he said. "This is about family." Family. The word landed heavily, weighted with expectation and threat. I shook my head. No. It was the first time I'd ever said that word to him without softening it, without explaining, without apologizing. Something shifted in his expression, confusion giving way to irritation, then to something colder. "You don't understand what you're risking," he said. I met his eyes. "I do." Emily scoffed. "Why are you being like this? You weren't even that close to Grandpa." The words stung, but they also clarified everything. They had never seen my relationship with him because it had never benefited them to look. "I'm not signing," I repeated. That was when my father stood up. He reached into his bag again, this time pulling out my diploma, the symbol of everything I'd worked for, everything they had barely acknowledged. "You don't deserve Grandpa's money," he said, his voice low and controlled. The lighter clicked. Gasps rippled across the table. My mother froze. Emily's confidence faltered. I watched calmly as the edges of the paper darkened and curled. Inside, something settled, not panic, not fear, but certainty. This wasn't a negotiation. This was control. And as the paper burned, I realized something else just as clearly. They thought destroying what I had earned would make me break. They had no idea how carefully I'd been taught to wait. And no idea what was already set in motion. For a moment after the flame died, no one spoke. The restaurant felt too quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. I could hear the faint clink of cutlery from other tables, the low murmur of conversations that had nothing to do with us. Life continuing, indifferent. My father looked at me, almost expectantly. I think he believed that was the moment I would finally break. That I would cry. That I would reach across the table and beg him to stop. That I would apologize for making things difficult. I didn't. I watched the last fragile edge of my diploma curl inward, then looked up at him. "Are you finished?" I asked. My own voice surprised me. It was calm, steady, not raised, not trembling. The kind of tone people use when they've already made a decision and see no reason to argue anymore. My father blinked. My mother inhaled sharply. "Chloe," she said, her voice tight. "You're overreacting." Overreacting. The word she always used when my feelings became inconvenient. Emily reached toward me, her hand hovering just short of my wrist. "Don't do this," she whispered. "You're embarrassing everyone." I pulled my hand back before she could touch me. "I'm not embarrassing anyone," I said. "I'm leaving." My father's jaw tightened. "Sit down." The command was automatic, practiced. The same tone he'd used my entire life when he expected compliance. I stood up instead. The chair scraped softly against the floor. It was a small sound, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Heads turned from nearby tables. Someone stopped chewing. Someone else stared openly. My mother finally stood too. "If you walk out now," she said quietly, "you're choosing to tear this family apart." I almost laughed. "You tore it apart long before tonight," I replied. "I'm just done pretending it's still whole." Emily shook her head, disbelief replacing entitlement. "You're really doing this? Over a piece of paper?" I looked at her, really looked at her. Not as my sister, not as the golden child, but as someone who had never once questioned where her advantages came from. "It was never about the paper," I said. I picked up my purse, folded my napkin neatly, and placed it on the table. A small habit, a final act of order in a moment that felt anything but orderly. My father stared at me, his expression shifting, not angry now, but unsettled. He had lost control, and he knew it. "This is what happens when you forget who supports you," he said. I met his gaze. "I can't remember a single time you did." The words hung between us, heavy and undeniable. No one followed me as I walked toward the exit. Not my mother, who was too busy maintaining her composure. Not Emily, whose world had just tilted in a direction she didn't understand. Not my father, who was still standing there, lighter in his hand, staring at the ashes of a symbol he thought would keep me obedient. Outside, the night air hit my face, cool, damp, real. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in. The city moved around me, cars passed. A couple laughed as they walked by. Somewhere nearby, music played softly through an open window. For the first time that evening, I felt grounded. I ordered a ride and watched the restaurant fade behind me as the car pulled away. In the reflection of the window, my face looked different. Not broken, not angry, resolved. My phone buzzed almost immediately. A message from Emily. "You went too far." Another from my mother. "Your father didn't mean it. He was emotional." Then an email notification from my father, already long enough to scroll. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I rested my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. Grandpa's voice echoed in my mind, calm and certain. "They're going to rush you." I wasn't rushing. I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. That night, I stayed at my Aunt Sarah's apartment. She opened the door without questions, took one look at my face, and stepped aside. "There's tea in the kitchen," she said softly. "You can talk if you want, or not." I didn't talk. I didn't need to. Lying on her couch later, staring up at the ceiling, I replayed the dinner in my mind, not with anger, but with clarity. Every word, every look, every carefully staged moment. It hadn't been a celebration. It had been a test. And for the first time in my life, I hadn't passed it the way they expected. As sleep finally crept in, one thought settled firmly in my chest. They believed tonight was the end of my resistance. They had no idea it was only the beginning. The morning after the graduation dinner, I woke up expecting to feel shattered. Instead, I felt clear. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains in my Aunt Sarah's living room, soft and almost forgiving. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was. Then everything rushed back: the restaurant, the lighter, the way my father had looked at me as if obedience were something he could still demand. My phone was already vibrating. I didn't pick it up right away. I made coffee first. I sat at the small kitchen table and let the warmth of the mug steady my hands. Only then did I look at the screen. Emily's messages came first. "You embarrassed us last night. Everyone thinks you overreacted. Dad is furious." I stared at the words, noticing what wasn't there. No concern, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done to me, just control. A second message followed. "You know Grandpa wouldn't want this much drama." I almost laughed. Emily had always spoken confidently about things she didn't actually understand. Then came my mother's call. I hesitated before answering. "Chloe," she said immediately, her voice soft, carefully measured. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," I replied. "Your father didn't mean what he did," she said. "You know how emotional he gets when he feels challenged." "Challenged. Not wrong. Not cruel. Challenged. You should apologize," she continued. "Not for refusing necessarily, but for the way you handled it." I closed my eyes. "Mom," I said quietly, "he destroyed my diploma." There was a pause, just long enough for me to know she'd already decided how to frame it. "It was symbolic," she said. "He was trying to make a point." "And what point was that?" I asked. "That you're forgetting your place," she replied before catching herself. The line went silent. I ended the call. By noon, my father's email arrived. 3 pages long, accusations wrapped in concern. Words like ungrateful, selfish, dramatic, repeated reminders of everything they'd provided for me. Near the end, buried beneath the anger, was the real message. "Sign the documents. Fix this. Be the daughter we raised." I didn't respond. Instead, I powered off my phone completely. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself not to explain, not to justify, not to smooth things over. The quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was protective. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and reread the email I had sent the night before. "Mr. Jonathan Reed, it's time." His reply was already waiting. "Understood. I'll notify all parties. Next week, Santa Monica office." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something close to relief. This was the process Grandpa had talked about. Slow, deliberate, impossible to intimidate with raised voices or emotional threats. The rest of the week passed in an uneasy calm. At work, I focused on tasks I could control. Code reviews, meetings, deadlines. In the evenings, I stayed with my aunt, helping her with groceries, watching old movies, letting normal life remind me that the world hadn't ended just because my family had lost control. One night, she finally spoke. "Your grandfather knew this would happen," she said gently. "That's why he trusted you." I nodded, the weight of that trust settling deeper in my chest. My phone stayed off, but messages piled up anyway. Missed calls, voicemails. One from Emily stood out. Her voice, no longer smug, sounded shaky. "I already told people the house was basically mine," she said. "You're making me look stupid." That was when I realized something important. They hadn't just assumed I would give in. They had already spent what wasn't theirs. By the time the day of the meeting arrived, I felt strangely calm. I drove to the lawyer's office early, parked across the street, and sat in the car for a moment. I thought about my grandfather's quiet patience, about the way he'd taught me to wait, to read, to prepare. I wasn't walking into that building as a daughter, asking for approval. I was walking in as the person he had trusted to protect his legacy. As I stepped out of the car and locked the door behind me, my phone buzzed once more, powered on just long enough for a final message from my father to come through. "You still have time to do the right thing." I smiled faintly. I already had. And inside that office, waiting behind polished wood and neatly stacked documents, was the truth they could no longer talk their way around. The lawyer's office didn't look like the kind of place where lives unraveled. It was clean, bright, quiet. Sunlight poured in through tall windows, reflecting off polished wood and glass surfaces. Everything felt deliberate, controlled nothing like the chaos my family thrived in. Mr. Jonathan Reed greeted me with a calm nod. "They'll be here shortly," he said. "Are you ready?" I straightened my blazer. "I've been ready for a long time." We sat at opposite ends of a long conference table. In the center lay a neat stack of documents, bound carefully, as if even paper deserved respect here. 5 minutes later, the door opened. My father walked in first. Richard looked confident at a glance, shoulders squared, jaw tight, but I recognized the tension beneath it. My mother followed, lips pressed together, already bracing herself. Emily entered last, sunglasses pushed up on her head, phone still in her hand like this was an inconvenience she planned to leave early. She froze when she saw me. "You're really doing this?" she muttered. I didn't respond. They took their seats across from me, forming a familiar line. A perfect reflection of every dinner table, every family meeting, every moment where I had been expected to listen instead of speak. Mr. Reed didn't waste time. "As stated in the official will of Thomas Miller," he began, his voice even and precise. The room seemed to still. He read slowly, deliberately, each word landing with intention. Dates, witnesses, legal language that left no room for interpretation. Then he reached the line my family had never prepared for. The full estate, including all properties, financial assets, business interests, and intellectual holdings, is to be transferred solely to his granddaughter, Chloe Miller. My mother's breath caught. Emily's mouth fell open. "That's not possible," she said sharply. "He promised." "No," Mr. Reed interrupted calmly. "He did not." My father leaned forward, his composure cracking. "This has to be a mistake," he said. "I'm his son," he would have told me. "He did tell someone," Mr. Reed replied. "Just not you." Emily slammed her hand onto the table. "I already made plans," she snapped. "I put down deposits. You can't just—" I finally spoke. "It wasn't yours to spend." She turned to me, eyes wide. "You don't even care about the house," she said. "You don't care about the company. Why should you get everything?" I met her gaze, steady and unblinking. "You don't know what I care about," I said quietly. "Because you never asked." My father shook his head, disbelief turning into anger. "You're too young for this," he said. "You'll ruin everything he built." I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not guilt, but resolve. "You mean I'll ruin your control?" I replied. The silence that followed was thick. Then Mr. Reed reached for a small remote on the table. "There's one more item," he said, at Mr. Miller's request. The screen at the end of the room flickered on. My grandfather appeared, seated in his study. He looked older than I remembered, frail, maybe, but his eyes were sharp, unmistakably clear. "If you're watching this," he began, "it means Chloe did exactly what I asked her to do." My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at the screen, frozen. "I watched my family overlook her," Grandpa continued. "I watched them reward the loudest voice instead of the strongest character," Emily whispered. "No. I watched Chloe stay quiet not because she was weak," he said, "but because she was paying attention." My chest tightened, but I didn't look away. "I'm leaving her everything," Grandpa said, "because strength should be trusted, not exploited." The video ended. No one spoke. I stood slowly, placing my hands flat on the table. Not to dominate the space, but to claim it. "This isn't revenge," I said. "This is protection. For myself, and for what Grandpa built." My father finally looked at me not as a child, not as someone to command, but as someone he no longer had power over. "You burned my diploma," I said evenly, "but you didn't burn my future." My mother looked down, tears forming, but I felt no urge to comfort her. Emily covered her face, shaking her head as if denial could rewrite reality. Mr. Reed slid the finalized documents toward me. I gathered them calmly, placing them into my folder. "This meeting is concluded," he said. I stepped back from the table. No one followed me. As I walked out into the bright California sun, something inside me finally loosened. The tension I'd carried for years, the constant readiness to defend myself, began to fade. For the first time in my life, the truth hadn't needed me to fight for it. It had spoken clearly, and everyone had heard it. After the meeting, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. Not in a painful way, but in the way a room feels after furniture has been moved out, strange, echoing, waiting to be filled with something new. I didn't hear from my parents that day, or the next, or the one after that. The silence was unfamiliar at first. For years, my life had been shaped by their reactions: approval, disappointment, pressure disguised as concern. Now there was nothing. No instructions. No expectations. Just space. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, close enough to bike to work in the mornings. It wasn't large. The furniture was minimal, but it was mine. Every decision inside those walls, what to buy, where to sit, when to rest, belonged to me alone. At work, things shifted quietly. I didn't announce what had happened. I didn't need to. I focused on my projects, took on more responsibility, and earned trust the way I always had, through consistency, not noise. When a leadership opportunity opened up, my manager didn't hesitate. "You're steady," he said. "People feel safe working with you." For the first time, that word felt like recognition, not dismissal. I also began spending more time reviewing Grandpa's business carefully, methodically. I brought in advisors, asked questions, listened more than I spoke. I remembered the way he used to sit across from me, patient, observant, never rushing a decision just to feel powerful. I wanted to do things differently. A month passed before my mother finally called. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. Her voice sounded smaller. "We don't know how things got this far," she said. "Your father is struggling." I waited. "You didn't have to humiliate us," she added quietly. That word, humiliate, settled heavily between us. "I didn't humiliate anyone," I replied. "I stopped protecting lies." She didn't respond. Emily never called. I heard through relatives that she'd moved in with friends, that plans had been postponed, that she was figuring things out. For the first time, the world wasn't rearranging itself around her comfort, and strangely, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. On quiet evenings, I stood on my balcony and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. The air was cool, steady. No one was watching me. No one was waiting for me to explain myself. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who swallowed words, who measured her worth by how little trouble she caused. I wanted to tell her something. You don't have to stay quiet to be safe. Sometimes, memories of the dinner crept back in the flame, the gasps, the way my father's voice had tried to command me into shrinking again. But those memories no longer had sharp edges. They felt distant, like scenes from a life I no longer lived. One night, I found an old voicemail from Grandpa saved on my phone. I hadn't listened to it in years. "Take your time," his voice said softly. "You're allowed to choose yourself." I closed my eyes and let the words settle. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for the next confrontation. I wasn't anticipating backlash or guilt or demands disguised as love. I was simply living. And in that quiet, I realized something I'd never fully understood before. Freedom doesn't arrive all at once. It comes slowly, through choices, through boundaries, through the courage to let silence exist without filling it with fear. I had spent years learning how to be quiet for others. Now, I was learning how to be quiet for myself, and that made all the difference. People often ask me if I regret that night, the graduation dinner, the moment I stood up, the moment I walked away. The truth is, I don't think about regret anymore. I think about clarity. For a long time, I believed strength meant enduring, staying calm, not causing problems. I believed love was something you earned by being agreeable, by making yourself smaller so others could feel larger beside you. I was wrong. Strength isn't enduring harm quietly. It isn't staying in rooms where your worth is questioned. And it definitely isn't sacrificing yourself to keep other people comfortable. Strength is knowing when something is wrong and refusing to participate in it any longer. When my father burned my diploma, he thought he was destroying proof of my achievement. What he didn't understand was that the diploma was never the source of my future. It was just a symbol. The real foundation had already been built in patience, preparation, and the quiet confidence my grandfather helped me grow. At the lawyer's office, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand apologies. I let the truth speak in the language my family respected most. Facts, documentation, law, and that mattered. Because justice doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from boundaries that are finally enforced. Today, my life is peaceful in a way I never imagined growing up. I wake up without dread. I make decisions without waiting for approval. I build things slowly, carefully, with intention. I surround myself with people who don't confuse control with love. My family is no longer part of my daily life, and that used to scare me. Now, it feels honest. I've learned that family isn't defined by who raised you, it's defined by who respects you, who listens, who doesn't need to diminish you to feel powerful. I still think about my grandfather often, about the way he trusted me without demanding proof, about how he understood that silence can be a strategy, not a weakness. He once told me, "You don't owe anyone access to your future." It took me years to understand what that meant. If you're listening to this and you've ever been told you don't deserve what's rightfully yours, your voice, your boundaries, your inheritance, your peace, I want you to hear this clearly. Calm doesn't mean weak. Walking away doesn't mean losing. And choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining, stop negotiating your worth, and let the truth stand on its own. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I waited, prepared, and trusted myself enough to let go of people who never truly saw me. And that more than anything is what real strength looks like.